Decoding Trump for India. So there are two questions, one of which I posed partly earlier, which is that which version of Trump are we looking at and how will that matter or not for the world? And second, how should India be gearing up for Trump on both economic and non-economic, including geopolitical fronts? I reached out to Dr. Irfan Nooruddin, the Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani Professor of Indian Politics at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And I began by asking him what had changed between Donald Trump's last stint and now.
The main thing that's changed is that the world has changed. Let's think of this as we're going to get to see a sequel of a movie that played 4 years ago and had a little bit of a gap in between. And now we get to see what the sequel looks like. And on the one hand, the fact that it's a sequel means that we know a little bit about the Trump playbook. We know how he thinks about international relations. We know his general skepticism for multilateral institutions, his willingness to sort of rip up established playbooks on alliances and partners and all of that. Maybe his fans would say he's a disruptor. But we also know the limits of that approach because the first Trump administration, while doing a lot of what he talked about, didn't do quite as much as some people thought he would do. But the big issue is, of course, that the interim, the Biden administration, followed through in a lot of the same ways, even though the rhetoric might have been different and the tone might have been different. The content of a lot of the Biden policy was quite similar. The anti-China-ness, for instance, remained a constant. The commitment to the Quad as a way of balancing against China remained pretty constant. For all of Trump's rhetoric, Biden was not a huge multilateralist, let's do global governance, let's be out in the world. He was more reserved in the use of American power around the world, even though a lot of people were very frustrated with him on that. So Trump comes back for all the rhetoric about, America being in a bad place and all of that, inheriting a very strong economy, but also a world that has really not had a lot of global governance and multilateral energy over the last 4 years either. There's a lot less to disrupt than there was in 2016 when he was taking over from 8 years of Obama, and an Obama that was really trying to rebuild America's image after the damage of the George Bush administrations globally. So I think the big change, I would say, is that the world now has a sense of who Donald Trump is. He's not going to be quite the shock to the system that he was 8 years ago. A lot of other things have also changed as a result of the pandemic. More countries have, in their own ways, become less dependent on the global economy or tried to shore up their global supply chains so that, whether it's nearshoring, friendshoring, all the words that we've heard. But I think countries understood that globalization, as had been the case in the 2000s, the 2010s, was not working for them and have pulled back in. And so even Trump's threats about, massive tariffs globally and uniform tariffs, I think have been met with a lot more sort of skepticism and maybe even sort of poking fun at than would have been the case 8 years ago when people would have said, oh my God, this is going to truly disrupt the world. Now I think there's a lot of, we don't actually think you can do what you're talking about doing. So just to summarize all of that, I think the key is that Trump will be a disruptor. There's a lot of American influence globally that we often take for granted or we don't really recognize. And that's partly that for all of its weaknesses, America has been the big champion of multilateral institutions and of global governance. Trump eroded that. Biden didn't really rebuild it for the most part. Trump will further erode it. So I think globally we have to be thinking about a world in which international institutions play a much less of a role, and there's a lot more bilateral transactionalism with the United States.
Right. And let's come to the India part now. One of India's big fears obviously has been tariffs. It seems to me that if he is set or likely to either not push tariffs or even dial back on tariffs with countries like China, because he's now opened multi-negotiating fronts with them, and the outcome of which one at least is already evident in the form of TikTok. It doesn't appear like there would be a rush to slap tariffs everywhere else because China was clearly the main target, at least the most demonstrable target. Anyway, so to come back to India, if we were to take the tariff threat or keep the tariff threat aside for now, which is the economic part of it, what else are you seeing?
The first significant high-level meeting that Trump is having is with the foreign ministers of the Quad countries, including External Affairs Minister Jaishankar. And so that's a signal, I think, that Trump once again understands that the signaling of taking the Quad as the first official meeting as president says that, okay, the Quad remains important. India is obviously a key part of that Quad. It signals also that he understands and his administration will continue to have China as the most significant strategic threat to the United States going forward. That is to India's benefit because there is no version, either on the Democrat side or the Republican side, it's bipartisan, that any response to China internationally has to involve India as a significant US partner. I think you'll continue to see investment in the US-India defense and military production relationship. We've already seen Indian entities being taken off the foreign entities list as a way of being able to push maybe more civil nuclear cooperation between the two countries. All of that is to the good. I do think Trump fundamentally doesn't understand international economics in a way that is not to India's advantage. And there's two things over here. He's obsessed with trade deficits and trade surpluses. And so any country that has a net trade surplus with the United States always has to worry that at some point Trump fixates on that and says, you're taking advantage of us, etc. Right? So there's a nuance to international trade that Trump doesn't appreciate and I think fixates on that particular dimension. But the second is that India's version of international trade vis-a-vis the United States isn't manufacturing goods, it isn't agricultural goods, it is the export of services. And I think that's one where you already see it playing out in the fight within the MAGA camp on H-1B visas. But, the ways in which that plays out has real implications for the ability of India's real engine of growth, the software companies and the service industry, to continue to grow the partnership with American companies and with American businesses. And there's always been a bit of a tension over there because Atmanirbhar Bharat and India's own goal of generating jobs at home was always going to be seen as a little bit of at odds with America first. But I think that's where I would be paying attention to. It's less on sort of the tariffs, which is really much more, as you said, China directed, might even be more Mexico directed, because that's where real goods are flowing across borders. Services, on the other hand, which involves a much more future-looking data and the flow of talent, that I think India is vulnerable to, and it's a bit of a wild card as to how Trump decides to play those dimensions of international economic policy.
Right, Irfan, thank you so much for joining me.
You're very welcome. Thank you.